Buenas tardes otra vez. Seguimos con el Seminario Internacional sobre Antisemitismo. Os quería informar solamente que ha habido un atentado en Jerusalén, para los que no lo sepan, otra vez con un coche, el mismo sistema que hace unos días, y ha habido un muerto y 13 o 14 heridos. Esto es de hace un par de horas, me parece, o algo así. Bueno, después de esta triste noticia os quiero presentar al doctor Steinberg. Nació en Londres, vive en Jerusalén desde hace 32 años, trabajó muchos años en prevención de proliferación nuclear y control de armas nucleares. También tengo que decir que tiene una formación científica, además de su doctorado en ciencias políticas, el motivo por el cual trabajó en estos sectores también. En Israel fue representante para Israel en el control de armas atómicas en Oriente Medio, donde se reunían con otros países en Viena, donde había un organismo que era de debate alrededor de armas atómicas, aunque Israel oficialmente no tiene el arma atómica. En los últimos 13 años, como él dice, ha intentado entender las ONGs, cómo se financian, cómo evolucionan y cuál es su actitud política. Para ello ha construido una fundación que llama NGO Monitor, un poco como Membri, para los que lo conocen, que controla la prensa o la televisión más bien. Él intenta controlar los flujos económicos de las organizaciones non-profit para ver cuando los estados financian estas organizaciones dónde va el dinero. Tiene también, esta organización, NGO Monitor, tiene un estatuto de observador en la ONU. También enseña Middle East Policy y Public Policy en Barilán. Tengo también que decir que es un hombre orquesta y muy brevemente os voy a leer 4 o 5 líneas de lo que ha hecho y hace en inglés, para no traducirlo, pero fue el founder of the Program of Conflict Management and Negotiation. He was awarded an Israeli Foundation grant, served as a team leader Israel at the Pole Research on the Peace Process and Israel-American Relations. He's a member of Israel Council of Foreign Affairs. He's a member of the advisory board of the Israeli Law Review International, appointed to the Israeli Higher Education Council, Committee of Public Policy. Following the Treaty of 1995, Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Review Conference, he was appointed the Israeli delegate to the IAEA Annual Academic Conference, examining proposals of a Middle Zone, East Zone free of weapons of mass destruction. Esto es una parte de su currículum, ya veis que es un hombre absolutamente completo, y le vamos a pasar la palabra. Mr. Steinberg, thank you very much for being here.
Organizers of this seminar. Can you hear me? Microphone.
Yeah, you have to, the red one, yes.
Okay. I'd like to congratulate, and first of all, I apologize. My Spanish is not good and my Catalan is even worse, so I'll have to speak in English. Oh, we can do this in Hebrew if you want, but I think we'll stick with English. And I promised Daniel, the translator, I'd try to speak slowly. This is a very important and impressive seminar. Many interesting speakers, and I'm very proud and honored to be invited to present the work that I do in this area. I deal with, as it says in the first slide in the title, contemporary anti-Semitism, which is often takes the form of anti-Zionism or anti-Israel activities. And many people will say, and I'll show you the illustrations, we're not anti-Semitic, Jews are okay. It's the Israelis, it's the Zionists that we don't like. It's the collective identification of the Jewish people and a collective anti-Semitism focused more and more on Israel. And we see this in many different ways, and particularly, as I will illustrate, in human rights groups, in humanitarian aid groups. They're very strong in Europe, they're very strong in Barcelona, Catalonia, and Spain, and elsewhere. And I want to give you some of the information that our research group has found. As you heard in the introduction, there's really the role and the power, the political power of human rights groups and humanitarian aid organizations has not really been studied, but they're extremely important. They have a lot of money, they have a lot of influence. I haven't looked at the Spanish or Catalonia newspapers today, the Barcelona newspapers, but I would guess that many of them are carrying a story about Amnesty International publishing a condemnation, a report about Israel. I read the report. It's really not even worth condemning. It's so bad. It's so poorly written. There's no research there. But every newspaper, every journalist tends to cover it and give it a headline. And that shows you something about the power of these organizations. Their influence, their political influence is very strong. And this is not going down because I have to hit this button. I started to examine this process, this phenomenon, in September of 2001. That was 13 years ago. There was a conference that took place in Durban, South Africa, under the banner of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, with the funding and support from the Canadian government, the European government, a number of international foundations. They brought 5,000 delegates from 1,500 organizations, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to Durban, South Africa to celebrate the end of apartheid and to adopt the process. It was called the United Nations Conference for the Elimination of Racism and Discrimination and Other Forms of Xenophobia. A very long name, very United Nations-like. But the point that they had in common was, at the end, this is the part of the declaration that they released. It was all focused on Israel. This movement, this anti-racist movement, the anti-apartheid movement, focused on Israel. Now, this language was actually written in Tehran. The United Nations held a preparatory conference, a preliminary conference, a few months before in Tehran. And this is the language that they wrote, and then it became adopted by all of these delegates in Durban, South Africa. And you see here language like apartheid and racism, criminal racism, genocide, ethnic cleansing. That's what Israel was being accused of. This was 13, 14 years ago. And the last point was the action item. It was the focus of what are we going to do? We're going to call and work for the complete international isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. And that's the origin of what's called the BDS movement, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. It's the origin of a lot of these campaigns, the flotilla and all the other things, the lawfare campaigns to arrest Israeli officials. We had, at one period, Spain also had there were some Israelis who were going to be arrested if they came to Spain, Israeli officials. It's usually identified with the left, but it's a form in which the left, the organizations that have captured the agenda of human rights and humanitarian aid, are using it for political warfare. So that was the beginning of the process that I started to study this. It was also a major increase in the involvement of the NGO community, the non-governmental organizations, in anti-Israel campaigns. And these organizations are very different. They have to be studied separately, and I'll just say it briefly. This is more of my academic work. They're supposed to be non-governmental organizations. That's the name, or sometimes they're called civil society organizations. But many of them get money from governments. Whose interests are they serving? Why do governments give them money? How do they decide, give money to this group but not to that group? And it's a very, very complex set of issues that need to be studied like normal politics. It's a form of politics. As I said, it generally involves, I'm going to have to get out my English version because I don't remember exactly what it says on these slides, but there is also in these organizations, although they talk a lot about democratic values, they themselves are not democratic. They're not open. There's no transparency. I talked about Amnesty International. I'll talk about it again, and I'll talk about other groups, Spanish group called Nova, which I'll talk about, and others, Israeli groups. Who decides what reports they're going to write? Who decides who the heads, who the presidents are, the officials, how they're going to spend their money? Amnesty International has a budget of about 350, 400 million euros a year. They have branches in many countries, in many regions. But the process by which they decide that they're going to write another report and another report and another report on Israel, or ignore Syria and Iraq, which is the history, and I've investigated this, somebody must make those decisions. So there's no democracy, there's no there's no transparency, there's no accountability. And what they are doing is they are seen as really, we call it the halo effect, like they're saints, like they're holy people, holy organizations, and nobody can criticize them. You very rarely see an article in a newspaper or a television section which asks the questions that I ask, which is a problem. We're talking about anti-Semitism. I could spend an hour giving you pictures like this. This is modern anti-Semitism. This is the last few years. Classic anti-Semitic pictures, but instead of, and with the pictures of the anti-Semitic pictures of Jews, or the octopus and the Jewish hands everywhere, arms everywhere. These are not from Nazi Germany of the 1930s, although they look like it. These are from the last 2 or 3 years by an NGO called Badil. These two pictures won prizes. Badil is a Palestinian refugee organization. It's supposed to be promoting the rights and the welfare of Palestinian refugees. And this is what they do with the money. Their money comes from a number of European countries. Switzerland is one of them. There's no what we call proper analysis or due diligence of what they do. And so you end up, when NGO Monitor, my organization, sent the 4 governments that fund this, the information, they stopped the funding for a little while, they changed a few people, and they started again. But we see these things over and over again. It's very often the same symbols, but applied to Israel rather than to Jews in Germany or Jews in other countries in Europe. And it's a very disturbing phenomenon, and it's very widespread. We see this very strongly in Palestinian and Arab NGOs. Some of you may recognize Hanan Ashrawi. She is one of the spokespeople for the Palestinians. She often appears on television and radio, comes to Europe a lot. She runs an NGO which has received almost $1 million from government funds. And on that website, they had a section that talked about Jews drinking the blood of Christians. They sent this as a letter. This is just last year, 2013. This is not from the Middle Ages. This is not from the period of the Holocaust. This is now. And a prominent Palestinian NGO that is funded by the United States government, by the European Union, by other, some of which is your money. And these are not, as I said, isolated examples. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I assume that you all know, or many of you know about this. It's very active. It tries to prevent artists from going to Israel, concerts, tries to prevent Israeli products from being sold in stores in Barcelona and elsewhere. And although they say that they're against the occupation and against Israel, you look at the language that they use, and they talk about the Jewish state. Not about changing the borders, not about the 1967, the post-67, what we call the post-67 agenda, but about 1948, about the right of Israel under any borders to exist. And that's a very common theme. If you look at the maps that they use, it's the maps of all of Israel, not of the occupied territories. One of the more tragic and more difficult issues is the role of Christian groups in this campaign. Very often we'll see in these campaigns statements of the former Bishop of Jerusalem, Naim Atik, who founded an NGO which is funded by a number of European countries. Should also have the British flag there, Sweden and others. And he goes around the world talking about the terrible things that the Zionists and the Jews are doing to the Palestinians, and he uses classical Christian theological anti-Semitic language. He talks about putting Jesus on the cross again. And this is now being distributed to hundreds of churches around the world. And now we see more and more of this process by which churches are adopting BDS resolutions. The Presbyterians in the United States, the Anglicans in London, and elsewhere. We also see it to a lesser degree, but still there, in Catholic organizations, Pax Christi, Caritas, and others. Language like this, or quoting him, Jesus on the cross, the Israeli government crucifixion system. This is anti-Semitism. This is classical anti-Semitism. It's not disagreeing with Israeli policies. Very often, and I don't know, maybe some of the other speakers will talk about this or have talked about this, anti-Semitism gets mixed with Holocaust denial or some form of abusing the Holocaust. And here we have an example of an organization, I think it's called the Alternative Information Center, which is funded by ACID, the Canadian government, the Spanish government, the federal government in Madrid. And it funds these kinds of statements which use the Holocaust, talking about using, well, you can see the language yourself here. This is not the language of peace. These are always funded under peace or under the headline of providing human rights. And this is not about peace. This is not about human rights. This is about abusing the Holocaust. One particular area where we see this a lot is in the medical NGOs. The biggest one in the world that everybody knows about, most people know about, is called Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, and I'm sure they have an active presence in Spain. But they're not the only ones. There are many others. And a group of these the heads of medical NGOs, for many years, have been using a medical journal called The Lancet to promote their hatred of Israel. This is a letter that was published in the most influential medical journal in the world, The Lancet. And it was published in, I can show it to you here, it was published, well, go back, in July, in the middle of the Gaza war. 24 medical professionals, most of them doctors, signed it. And they accused Israel of war crimes. They accused Israel of violating international law. They talked about apartheid, again, all the language that started in Durban and keeps being repeated over and over and over again. This was in the medical journal, The Lancet. When we looked, and our NGO Monitor is a research organization, and we started to look at who the people who signed this are. These are doctors, but doctors who run NGOs. And it turned out that they were circulating in an email group among themselves, but in a public way, videos of a white supremacist, anti-Semite, the head of the American Ku Klux Klan by the name of David Duke. So these were not only radical anti-Israel doctors that were writing things about Israel and making claims which were lies, but they were hardcore classical anti-Semites. This is a film, I don't have it, I should have brought it to show it, maybe we can work it out later. But this is about Zio media, Zio money, Zio ops, Zio politics, Zio banks. It's about how the Jews control the world. And this is, again, classic anti-Semitism that was circulated by a group of doctors who published their letter on Gaza condemning Israel in this medical magazine. And it is very much part of this process. These NGOs that these doctors and others run also have budgets of millions of pounds and dollars and euros to promote this kind of propaganda. Just to carry on the story a little bit, you can see in the corner, I should have brought the pen that I can put a red light with, but this is a publication that NGO Monitor wrote about this. This is Richard Horton, who's that's David Duke, and this is the response that the two of the doctors who run the NGOs, Medical Aid for Palestinians and the New Weapons Project, the way they've responded in a very non-serious way to the revelations. It shows you how deep the anti-Semitism is in the people who are, even doctors, even professionals who are supposed to be educated, how deep the anti-Semitic concepts and frameworks are in those areas. And I think certainly I've been studying this for many years, and after the Durban conference and so many other aspects of this, the depth of this type of offensive anti-Semitism surprised me. Since we're in Catalonia, which is within at least the boundaries of Spain, I better stay away from politics here before the referendum. But it's important for me to talk about where the money comes from. These NGOs that do this, these campaigns are not something that are funded and done by three people in a garage somewhere. These are very well financed activities. The European Union, all of the 28 or 29 countries, provide about 100 million euros of taxpayer money to these kinds of NGOs every year, to dozens of them. There's never any analysis or discussion, at least until we started doing the research on this and presenting it. And in Spain, both at the level of Madrid and also primarily in Catalonia, there are millions of euros that are given every year to NGOs that are involved in these kinds of delegitimization projects focusing on Israel. It was, up until we did our report, this was a report that we published in 2013, covering the period through 2011. And I left a couple of copies. I think there's still one outside. I have one in English here, and it's all on our website. It can be downloaded. Very often, the governments don't know where their money goes. I would say in all the cases. Hundreds of NGOs working on issues that have to do with Israel and Palestine and the Middle East, and they don't know, the governments that give the money don't know where the money goes. It's usually under a headline, a category of funding for peace, funding for human rights, funding for humanitarian aid. But they all become part of this political campaign. Give you one example of, since we're in Barcelona, there's a framework called the Russell Tribunal that meets, and it is a pretend court. It's actually an entirely anti-Israel panel. They met in Cape Town, South Africa. I spoke on the radio, debated some of the leaders of that. They met in New York. They met in Brussels, and I think they met once in Barcelona. The city of Barcelona provided in those days, 56,000 euros. That's not a lot of money. But they got money also from Belgium, from Brussels, and a few other places, and that was enough to hold these campaigns. They generate publicity, and they repeat all the language that we talked about earlier. The apartheid, the ethnic cleansing, the racism, the deliberate murder, the war crimes. Those are the themes that we hear every day about Israel and Israeli actions. Now, I should say also that in all of these frameworks, there's no money going to condemning or trying to prevent Hamas from firing missiles, or for teaching Palestinians to accept or understand the Israeli history, the Jewish history. It's all focused on Israel. All of which Israel is seen as the stronger power, and therefore Israel must change its policies. And it's the Palestinians who are always suffering. In the letter here that I showed you from the Lancet from July of 2014, the word Hamas does not appear, and there are no missiles. No mention of missiles. Now remember, it says a pretext that Israel acted against Gaza, attacked Gaza on a pretext of self-defense. There were 4,563 rockets and missiles in 51 days. And when you think about that, 4,563 missiles. Somebody had to pay for those, somebody had to put them into the storage area, somebody had to fire them. That's a huge industry, and yet humanitarian medical aid groups don't mention them. They erase them completely from the record. So when we look at where the money comes from and how the money is distributed to support the NGO campaigns, that's a very important dimension of this process. Sorry, okay. So, give you some examples, and again, I think this is extremely important. If there's one message I have, it is to look carefully at the NGOs. Now, I'm not saying that all NGOs are bad. I'm not saying that all human rights groups are corrupt. There are some that do not participate in this. There are some that criticize Israel, but not using double standards or false claims. But it's harder and harder to find them. There's more and more of the attacks on Israel that have no base and that are being used as part of political warfare. Talked about another aspect, humanitarian aid. And here's an example. Again, the Spanish government in Madrid, ACID, hope I pronounce it right. I was in Madrid about a year and a half ago and spoke about this at the parliament. And they listened, and I think they changed some of the policies, but some continue. The Islamic Relief Worldwide is an NGO. It's a humanitarian aid NGO. It has a budget of about $20 million a year. It operates in many countries for providing assistance. There are church groups that provide assistance, and so Islamic leaders in Europe went to the government and said, we should also get government money to help Muslims in Iraq and Syria, and there's a lot of warfare and suffering. But they also work in Gaza. And in Gaza, they provide money and structural support for Hamas. I would guess, we wrote to the Spanish government, we wrote to the European Union, we wrote to the British government, all the governments that provide money for this organization. The British and the EU both said that they will not provide any documentation. Most other countries didn't respond. Do you know where your money goes? Does it go to Hamas? Does it go to the ISL that's chopping off heads in Syria and Iraq? How do you know where the money goes? And that's a very important question. Nobody usually responds in a proper manner. The research that we do examines each NGO that's involved, each government that funds it. And this is a small summary of the report that we wrote about Spain. Again, you see both at the national level and at the regional level. Now, I don't know much about what happens here. We have a researcher who studied the documents, told that his Spanish wasn't always accurate, so he probably comes from South America. He looked both at the Madrid government, Andalusia, and also at Catalonia. And one of the biggest organizations that we see active, you see, by the way, look at the different things that they get funded for. And look at the amounts, €1 million for solidarity and action, 2.3 million, then another 480,000 for peace cooperation. Where does the money go? There's no peace. So what do they do with the money? And yes, you can say they run dialogues and they try, but after 10 years, after 15 years, you have to ask, why is this continuing and who's checking it? It gets a momentum of its own. Here's the European Association of Cooperation with Palestine, 2.1 million euros. Where does the money go? What do they do with it? And then this NOVA organization, the Center for Social Innovation. I won't even try to pronounce it in Spanish or Catalan. I know something about where the money goes, and it's not very good. And I wonder, when the government of Catalonia provides this money to NOVA, or when the government in Madrid provides more of this money to, this is at least one place where Madrid and Barcelona agree, to radical organizations like this. Do they know where the money goes? So some of the money also goes to the Russell Tribunal. Some of them also, and it's supposed to go towards reducing violence and improving relations. I think it should be nonviolence, actually. Some of this money goes to a project that is coordinated through two other NGOs. One is called the Coalition of Women for Peace, and the other one is the Palestinian Solidarity Committee. This is what they do with the money. They participate in demonstrations. These are from the Facebook page of these organizations. In violent demonstrations, the flag they're carrying is a flag of a terrorist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That's the flag that they're carrying with them. This is the organization. Now, I'm not saying that the money goes from Catalonia or from ACID to a terrorist group. What I am saying is that the money goes to organizations that work with and support terrorist groups, and it needs to be investigated. There should be some sort of red line, some sort of guidelines. Some sort of reports, not just what the organizations say they're doing with the money, but somebody independent has to look at it. And when it's used for this kind of violence and this kind of hatred, directed at Israel, and that becomes a form of anti-Semitism, it should not be continued. And I think these sort of discussions need to be held. This is another organization funded by through Barcelona, through the autonomous community of Catalonia. These are all small amounts, but other groups provide them with money, and it's still enough to do media activities against Israel. The allegations by this organization that Israel commits serious breaches of international law and violations of human rights. For 63 years, this is 3 years ago. This is, again, not about occupied territory. It's not about settlements. It's not about borders. It's about the right of Israel. They're calling Israel an apartheid state, not because of relations with the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but because Israel exists. And that's a form of anti-Semitism and racism. And it's a good question to be asked. What should be the limitations of funding solidarity organizations? There's also money going to Palestinian groups that are active in a lot of these BDS activities, boycotts against Israel, calling Israel an apartheid state, what we call the Durban Agenda. These are large amounts of money that continue to be provided The numbers are old and some of them have been stopped, but we think about 1.6 million continues to go every year. The names sound good. Diffusion of democracy. And the populist struggle for coordination committee may be less, or the Rural Women's Development Association, but a lot of that money goes for political warfare that singles out Israel. And so you have here some examples of those Palestinian organizations and what they do with the money. They support the BDS movement. They accuse Israel of racism. They accuse Israel, and today you mentioned that there was another terror attack in Jerusalem. One of these organizations, Al-Maqdisi, which gets quite a bit of money from many sources, including $800,000 from the Spanish government over the last few years, also from the European Union, Judaizing Jerusalem. Now, unless you live, and I live in Jerusalem, what does it mean to Judaize Jerusalem? It's another phrase of saying ethnic cleansing. The Jews are taking over Jerusalem. This is political propaganda that is an excuse for terrorism. It's part of the political warfare against Israel. And it's coming from Spanish sources and many other European countries. Spain is not different, but because we're sitting here, I'm using this as primarily as an example. Or the Palestinian Agricultural Committee, PARC, which is active and supports and sends people and money to support the BDS campaign, the boycotts against Israel, so they don't have Israeli products in supermarkets. Another example, this one coming from, I believe, Basque region, an organization called Mewando, which celebrates every year in public ceremonies the Nakba, La Nakba, the disaster. That's the same thing as the creation of Israel, the independence war. The war that the Arabs fought to eliminate Israel. It's the Palestinian language, the Palestinian agenda. It's the refusal to, the denial of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. And finally, there are a group of Israeli NGOs, some of which are active in different aspects of this, which are continuing to get money all on the fringe of Israeli politics. So what I'm saying is that it's important, and this is my last slide, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion, right? This is, first of all, I invite you to use the website, the NGO Monitor website, for any organization that you're interested in or that your money goes to. If we don't have a section on it, we can write one. We do have at least one Spanish speaker now in our office. We have the report on Spain, which we've updated and we continue to update. I think it's very important. We call one of our slogans is watching the watchers. Who watches the watchers? When organizations condemn Israel for violating human rights or for war crimes or violating international law, they act as a monitoring organization, as a watchdog. But who's watching these watchdogs to make sure they stay honest? These organizations work closely in the United Nations with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the biggest bloc now in the United Nations. They're the ones who vote for the reports that condemn Israel for violating human rights in Gaza. The NGOs are right there with them all the time. It's a very close alliance. If we're going to be, first of all, aware of the power of this form of anti-Semitism, the influence, and then demand that governments stop funding or create guidelines for organizations that they fund so that they don't abuse this money, they don't exploit this money for the types of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel propaganda that we see, the double standards, the political warfare, the boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. It's important to maintain this discussion, make it public in very different venues, and that's what we do, and I would hope that we would continue also with the assistance of those of you who are active in this area. So thank you for your attention. You've been very quiet, either you've been asleep because it's after lunch, or maybe I've stimulated some discussion. Okay, now I have to put these back on, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Steinberg. Y si hay preguntas, serán bienvenidas.
Sorry?
Gracias. Thank you. Mr. Steinberg, I'm a Catalan from here, from Barcelona. I'm a journalist, and I happen to know Israel quite well. I follow it. I have friends there. Some of the things you have shown, I can assure you, it sickens me as much as they do sicken you, some of this language. But I also know a lot of Israelis who would not agree with you, not because of this, but because some of the other things sometimes your organization does, and you have not tell us. Because I think the bottom line is that there is a tremendous political, ideological battle in Israel, and your organization, which is well known, NGO Monitor, considered a right-wing, some would even deem as a far-right organization that harasses most left-wing human rights NGO, Israeli NGOs, that I don't think you could accuse of as anti-Semitism. Whether we are talking about the Association of Civil Rights of Israel, whether we are talking about B'Tselem, whether we are talking about Peace Now, whether we are talking about the New Israel Fund. I'm not going to argue with you, it's not my call. But I think that the audience has a right to know what your organization stands for. And on the issue of funding, that you're right, I know you lose a battle against the European Union courts, that I think it lasted for over 4 years, over transparency on funding. And I also know that one of your employees have been banned from editing Wikipedia, if I'm not wrong. That happened a couple of years ago, or maybe a year ago.
I see that you read all the wrong blogs and you believe all the nonsense that people put out there.
I read Haaretz and other Israeli media. I just wanted that, I think it's fair that the people know that, and there are a lot of Israelis who would be quite annoyed. And it saddens me, because sometimes I think with these battles that in this conflict, the extremists are like winning, you know. So I also wonder whether you have ever intended to monitor the funding of some of the right-wings NGOs like Im Tirzu, the Yesha Council, and we could continue. Thank you. But it's not my call to argue with you. I mean, it's your privilege to do what you do. Some of these things I'm telling you, I deplore them as much as you do. And I am against BDS. I've stated it here, you know, in war and in writing. And I deplore anti-Semitism.
Okay, I agree with you that
Thank you.
This should not be an argument. I'm here to talk about NGO anti-Semitism. I'm an academic. I'm not an ideologue. You know, one of the strange things that happens, and as you can look at this on the internet, and of course there are battles all the time. I talked about Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, two powerful international organizations. They have never been criticized before until our organization began to criticize them. And we criticize them on academic research grounds. When you write a report, when an organization writes a report and gets published in all the newspapers and says Israel committed war crimes, and the people who wrote that report are anonymous and probably don't know anything about what they're talking about. Or when you have the example of the Lancet, that's not ideological right or left. These organizations respond by, like an octopus, we had a picture of an octopus, they send out poison ink. They attack the critics. And people who know me and know my work and have read it and don't rely on a few blogs and very marginal and unprofessional claims know that I am not right-wing or left-wing. I'm an academic. I see complexity. We could talk about the territories and borders forever, but it's much easier to avoid a serious discussion if you attack your critic with these types of labels. You may be surprised that Yariv Oppenheimer, the head of Peace Now, and I are close friends, that we speak together. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree. You mentioned the lawsuit we had against the European Union. Yes, we lost the lawsuits, and they were wrong. We have another lawsuit against them because they were hiding the information. I think if you're a European citizen and you want to know where your money goes, you don't want it to be kept secret. You want to know why these decisions are made and who makes them. How do you know that somebody's cousin is not the one who's deciding you're going to give $1 million to this group that operates in the West Bank? It's all secret. How do they get the money? Who makes those decisions? Nothing else is as secret as that is. It's amazing. So there's an NGO industry that's trying to protect itself, and it's not just left or right. Criticism is not a right-wing or a left-wing ideological process. It's part of the academic world. When political power is used, it needs to be examined. And when governments provide money to Israeli right-wing organizations, then those will also need to be examined. But the fact is that all the money goes to one very narrow portion of the political spectrum, with lots of implications which are beyond what we're talking about. I'm here to talk about anti-Semitism, and I'm glad that you agree with me that there are many cases here that public money should certainly not have been provided for. And then I've done my job if that we agree on that. We can disagree on other issues later.
Hola, buena tarde, profesor Steinberg. Yo le quería hacer una pregunta, simplemente porque esta es la primera conferencia que se realiza en Barcelona que analiza críticamente las organizaciones que mediante un discurso pro derechos humanos, de hecho, esconden la propagación de un prejuicio, que es el del antisemitismo o el de la judeofobia. Y lo que me parece grave es que esta sea la primera conferencia en Barcelona que aborde este tema o este problema. Es decir, que ONGs que con un discurso pro derechos humanos, de hecho, lo que están fomentando es un prejuicio hacia una de las minorías existentes en Barcelona, o en Cataluña, o en España, que es la comunidad judía. Basta leer, yo ahora tengo aquí delante mío pues, la página web de la organización de boicot, desinversiones y sanciones, concretamente la página web de la organización en Cataluña, y digamos, el discurso es paz, justicia e igualdad. Esta es la presentación, paz, justicia e igualdad. Pero cuando uno empieza a leer, bueno, pues resulta que detrás de esta red hay 170 entidades u organizaciones que desde el año 2005 existe. Y mi pregunta es, no solo para usted como profesor, porque de hecho, digamos, no conoce mejor, digamos, tan bien quizás como nosotros la realidad en Cataluña o en España, pero ¿cómo puede ser que durante 9 años en ningún foro académico o foro público se haya analizado críticamente una red de organizaciones tan numerosa como esta, que de hecho, y yo pongo la mano en el fuego, que muchas de estas entidades no se dan cuenta de lo que están haciendo? Sí, sus líderes, digamos, los líderes de esta organización. Pero ¿cómo puede ser que durante 9 años en un país democrático nunca se haya analizado críticamente una red que propaga el antisemitismo como es la de boicot, desinversiones y sanciones? ¿Y cómo puede ser justamente que con los impuestos nuestros, de sus ciudadanos y ciudadanas, se esté pagando justamente una organización como esta, ¿no? Esta es la razón, entre otras, porque consideré, y la Fundación también, y la Universidad también, consideramos importante que un catedrático de Ciencia Política que analiza este esta cuestión estuviera hoy aquí, ¿no? Es decir, porque ¿cómo puede ser que durante 9 años nadie haya hecho una conferencia, una ponencia o un análisis de una organización que está propagando la judeofobia del siglo XXI? Y que esto repercute en la vida cotidiana de la comunidad judía, de los judíos y de aquellas personas que no son judías, pero que hablan, vamos a decirlo así, de forma normal, natural o equilibrada sobre la comunidad judía o sobre el Estado de Israel.
This is one of those questions where the question is always much better than the answer is going to be. The how can it be is I don't have a good answer for that. I can add a few or restate a few points that I made earlier. NGOs have always been considered to be, human rights groups have always been, humanitarian aid groups have always been considered to be part of religion. I missed something, what? And not to be questioned. It's really like a priesthood. If they're doing good things, then nobody should question them. And at the same time, a lot of the work takes place in secret. The reason that we have filed lawsuits is when we're denied, when citizens are denied freedom of information, documentation on how decisions are made for precisely these kinds of organizations. There really has been for 20 years, or at least 15 years, the money was available. I'll say a few words about, in general, about how the process works. And the networks are very important here. It's very much of a network process. And we know that NGOs, there is beginning to be academic work in general on the networking of non-governmental with governmental allies in different areas, not only on Arab-Israeli conflict issues, but also in the environment, other issues where NGOs play a significant role. The fact that so much money, you have a budget, I don't remember what ASID's annual budget is, it's probably tens of millions of euros a year. And it's broken down into different areas. So they'll have an Africa bureau and a South America bureau and a Middle East bureau. And within the Middle East bureau, there'll be a Palestine desk. And the decisions that are made there are made locally. They're not reported. You can't look it up. And now we can. It's beginning now to be available on the internet. But for many years, it was never traced. So it was not seen, and therefore, it was not seen and not seen to be a problem. So you didn't have academics looking at it. There was no research. You didn't have government reports. You didn't have journalists looking at these phenomenon. And that's beginning to change. You talked about Judeophobia. And even now, in many places it's being denied, but I think it's now harder and harder. And you saw some of the images, and I have many more, of the NGO element of Judeophobia, or allegations that Israel is Judaizing Jerusalem. One can disagree on policy, but when the language is the one that we saw, or language that Israel is like the daily crucifixion of Jesus, when you end up with that kind of anti-Semitic language or Judeophobic language, also for many years it was considered to be too marginal to look at, a very marginal phenomenon. But the BDS movement is not marginal anymore. So I think that we are at the end of that period of no serious research, no serious criticism. And the fact that you're doing this conference, I think, is part of the, it illustrates, it highlights that this period is opening up now. We need to look at these issues. We need to know where this anti-Semitism and Judeophobia is coming from, both in terms of the organizations and the funding for them and their role and influence, if we're going to, like any other phenomenon that has to do with racism and xenophobia.
I would like to know two things, basically. The first thing is about from all these organizations that come from basically Christian countries, how many of them are really worried about what is going on with Christian populations on the area? Because at this moment, The Christian populations are suffering displacements, murders, mass murder, and it looks like that these organizations are not so worried about what happens with Christian people coming from Christian countries. This is the first thing that it looks like very contradictory for people that is so good and so worried about human rights without not any prejudice. This is the first thing that I think that is very strange. I would like to know how many money goes to that and how many organizations of this type are worried at this moment of this problem. And the second thing that I would like to know if there is any possibility that we know what is already going on, what we can do here from Europe to make possible that people really know that all what is going on, all what they are receiving, and to monetize the work of these NGOs. How can we do something not in a level that is a national level, but more in a European level? I think that we begin to have a nice Jewish organizations that are young Jewish organizations that perhaps they can do something. I would like to answer these two questions if you are so kind.
Also two very good questions, and I will try to give somewhat good answers. The human rights, it really is, I teach a class and I write books about the politics of human rights. And it makes people very angry sometimes who do human, because they say, we don't do politics. But they choose issues, and they come in waves, and they all go together. Everybody focuses on Israel. A lot of these groups attack the United States and the West. Some of these groups actually called Colonel Gaddafi a human rights reformer. Amnesty and Human Rights Watch back a few years ago went to Saudi Arabia to collect money. There's almost nobody, none of these human rights organizations that issue reports on Christians in Syria and Iraq, in Egypt. There's a little bit on the Copts now, but not much. And that's a strange phenomenon. I don't have the slide here, but we did a chart. We examined a lot of organizations that do global human rights, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and what they do in the Middle East, the United Nations Human Rights Council. The United Nations Human Rights Council, which is very much part of this, there's the UN and there's the NGOs, and they work closely together in Geneva. The UN Human Rights Council passes half of its resolutions every year are about Israel. And then you have one or two about Syria, one or two about Iraq, one or two about North Korea, one or two, but half of them are about Israel. The resources are all focused on Israel. It's easy to do. Everybody can agree to attack Israel. But the Syrians don't want to talk about Christians in Syria. And the Egyptians don't want to talk about Copts in Egypt. That's an internal problem. They don't want to discuss it. They're embarrassed by it. So you have very little activity. I have not seen much work by groups like Pax Christi and Caritas, two Catholic human rights and humanitarian aid organizations, on the attacks and the murder of Christians in the Middle East. And when we met with the papal nuncio in Jerusalem about the role of NGOs that are Catholic funded, and he said he understood the problem. He didn't have a good answer. So I can just tell you that the problem is there, and it's very much these political correct, everybody goes and follows the same issue. Like journalists will all write the same thing, and there's no independent thinking. Not all journalists. Some can think independently. The issue, the second issue that you raised about what can be done, I think is the most important thing. In each community, you talked about Europe, but I think that's also important. And there is not really much of an umbrella organization. I'm going to Brussels next week to present some of this, not slightly different because the focus is not anti-Semitism, but it is politicalization and the Arab-Israeli conflict. But there are groups, small community groups, in a number of countries that have similar seminars or issues here. I spoke in Rome to a group, and I'm trying to bring some of the people together. Again, being careful about the politics, but there's a group in Madrid, the Lawyers Committee Against Anti-Semitism, that raised this issue in the parliament in Madrid that I provided the information for. There's somebody here from France, and we know that the CRIF In France, the French umbrella organization is trying to deal with these issues. So there is an effort being made in a number of different places. There's a group in Holland called CD, which is also focusing on this. We're going to, actually, I think you've raised a good point, and somewhere on our website we're going to put all the addresses of all the groups together so that they can actually communicate with each other, because it needs to be done, and it does have to be done on a European level, I agree.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Steinberg, y nos encontramos a la 1:30 para la siguiente conferencia. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.